köszöntök, Schöpflin György vagyok. Én vagyok mondjuk az ötletgazdája ennek a konferenciának, ami természetesen egy provokáció, legalábbis a címe egy provokáció, és tessék megnézni a címet, ott van egy kérdőjel. De valójában én egy vitát szeretnék kiprovokálni, hogy mi lesz ennek az eredménye, remélem, hogy délután folyamán kiderül, de minden esetre szeretném megkérdőjelezni azokat a gondolatokat, azokat az alapfelfogásokat, amelyekben a világ, legalábbis az európai világ táplálkozik. Na most magyarul kezdtem, de angolul fogok beszélni, van szinkrontolmácsolás, az 5-ös csatornán elérhető a másik nyelv. Tehát mind a kettő, magyar és angol is, mind a kettő az 5-ös csatornán érhető el. So, liberalism. Now, my basic starting point is that when I was young, liberalism was quite different from what it is today. And I think that liberalism has undergone a far-reaching shift. I think there's been a shift away from its historic roots. By its historic roots, I mean John Stuart Mill, Alexis de Tocqueville, someone who I find quite interesting, Francis Lieber, who was a German who went to America. I think this is common ground. I don't think anybody is going to object too strongly to my definition, which is that this liberalism was about tolerance, was about debate, it was about freedom from tyranny, great emphasis on liberty, and on the importance of institutions. That institutions are there to ensure that these values are safeguarded. Now, what I think is happening, and I think we're in the midst of a major historical change, is a shift which involves the weakening of the role of representation, which then, of course, questions the whole question of government by consent. And I think that representation is actually the central element of democracy and of institutional authority. Instead of which, what we're seeing, this is provocation number one, or possibly provocation number two, is the emergence of a hegemony. I'm using this sense in the Gramscian sense, a claim, an imperative and practice that a particular view of the world is the sole legitimate political, economic, ethical way of seeing things. In other words, you don't question it. It's a naturalized order. Now, the consequence of this is that there has emerged something like a monopoly claim over democracy. That democracy must be liberal democracy and be ruled exclusively by liberal values. The consequence of which is that popular sovereignty, which I think actually is the basis of democracy, tends to be marginalized in favor of democratic values. I believe that there is a conflict here between popular sovereignty and liberal democratic values. What we're seeing every day, effectively, actually, is the systematic dismissal of any questioning of liberalism as populism. And I think this supports my proposition that the role of the people in a democracy is seen as secondary at best. And from this perspective, I would argue there is a real danger of a liberal reductionism that insists that democracy is about liberal values, only about liberal values, and excludes consent to the exercise of power. And if I'm right, and that I hope we'll argue about this, then we're seeing a kind of reversal of the legacy of the French Revolution, that the legitimate exercise of power requires the consent of the governed. The early part of the French Revolution, I hasten to add, I'm not talking about Derrida. There is a proposition, I've had this argument with some of my centre-right colleagues in Brussels, that liberal democracy is no more than a form of government, that actually it's value-free. Now, I don't believe this to be the case. I don't think anything is value-free. I think everything is in some form or another valorized. I do not believe, on the contrary, that liberal democracy is value neutral. I think they're both heavily valorized, which does mean that we've got to look at what liberal values are and in what way they've evolved and how we've got to where we are at this particular time. I've argued elsewhere, and this is part of the crisis of values in Europe, is that we're in the midst of an epistemological closure. That's to say, you get this whenever you get something which is strongly naturalized, that the existing set of values, assumptions, arguments are the only way of looking at the world, the consequence of which is a refusal to engage in debate, obviously going directly contrary to John Stuart Mill. There's intransigence, impatience, dismissal of questioning. So the next question I want to put is, how did we get there? How did this form of liberalism, which we're now living in, come into being? Some of you may remember Hayek's either last one book about the conceit of socialism. Well, I think there's a conceit of liberalism, a particular conviction that this is the only way of seeing the world. And I think that my answer to this rhetorical question is that liberalism claims 5 really major victories in the last 150 years. First of all, liberalism has to some extent marginalized religion, primarily Christianity. Marginalized in the sense that up until the end of the 18th century, Christianity was exemplary and binding. That's the Weberian term. This is no longer the case. There is secularism. Footnote here, that actually Europe is the most secularized part of the world. Religion is alive and well in most other parts of the world, including the United States. Secondly, I don't think there's any dispute over this, liberalism, together with some help from other currents, achieved a major victory over fascism, Nazism, fascism. Thirdly, again, not on its own, a major victory over Marxism. And then in the 90s, I think we've seen a major victory by liberalism over nationhood and ethnicity, and to some extent over the state. What should be the role and function of the state? And the liberal proposition is that individual interest, market freedom transcends the role of the state, and the state should be secondary. Now, if you accept this argument, then of course you can see why liberals are so full of themselves. That's the conceit part. And I would go on further and would argue that actually liberalism has also captured modernity. What does it mean to be modern? How do we define this? And then you get the answer, well, in the way in which we liberals say. In a way, what liberalism is doing is arguing that it is the sole legitimate variant of all these phenomena. There is in this the universalism, that the particular West European, or to some extent North American variant of liberalism, is the only way of understanding the world. And the consequence of that is that what I'm inclined to see is that the liberalism that I have been sketching does not accept competitors, whether it's China or racism or Islam as a viable alternative view of the world. Let me give you one example of this, and that's if you look at the obituaries of Lee Kuan Yew, who was ruler of Singapore for decades. He turned Singapore from a backward swamp into a very successful, very prosperous city-state without democracy. And I saw a number of obituaries when he died earlier this year saying, yes, he may also have done it, but it was also a thoroughly nasty dictator. In other words, that there is an alternative. This is the so-called Asian values, which you sometimes encounter, which is actually to do with family as a kinship group, as a collective, but it does not conform to the assumption that liberals make about what a proper way of running society is. Now, the victory over Marxism, which I've mentioned, the collapse of communism, has had unintended consequences because although conceptually distinct, it went hand in hand with the rise of globalization. And I think that this contributed significantly to the undermining of trade unions and social democracy. The causation is difficult to disentangle here, but I think we can see the outcome. The manual working class, which is obviously diminished by technological change, now has no real political home, no organized presence in politics. This left sizable sections of citizens, of voters, open to mobilization by new political movements, some of the left, some of the right. I'm thinking of Podemos and Syriza, or alternatively the Front National, or Wilders, or Sweden Democrats, and a whole panoply of far left and far right movements. I think that voters, not all of them, but a substantial number of them, have the sense that they have been left behind, that nobody is really listening to their needs and requirements, and they may also have difficulty grasping the implications of globalization. I'm thinking here of complexity theory, which I'm not going to go into, but the classical linear way of moving from A to B to C is now seriously under challenge from the way in which we're seeing multiple actors impacting on one another, the consequence of which I've written about. I'm not going to go into great detail. The black swans, the unpredictable, the unexpected crisis. If you like, this year's migration crisis was a classic black swan. Nobody foresaw it. It just arrived from nowhere. At least it was very difficult to foresee. So this abandoned part of society is basically ready to listen to whoever offers them a place in the democratic order. Some of this, it seems to me, is properly understood as being about interests, but I think it's also vitally about political identity. To the established elites and established parties, these are a danger, and the process is widely dismissed as populism, which means that the aspirations of these social strata, who are evidently uneasy with free markets and are not persuaded by social liberalism, are left, if you like, in a kind of political void. So let's not be surprised by the emergence of these political forces. It's a new phenomenon, 4 or 5 years, no more, widely condemned, as I say, as populism. Now, this also suggests, this is a kind of footnote, that one of the functions of a political party is to provide a framework for political activity for the entirety, or at least almost the entirety of the population. That is what citizenship is about, being active politically. But as I've been arguing, political parties are also a source of identity, one that operates, I think, within the much wider identity of nationhood. And I think that social democratic parties perform this very well. Christian Democrats did likewise. Liberal parties, historically, were linked to particular social strata, middle-class professionals, but I think today what liberalism offers is too diffuse to embrace and frame wider sections of the population, given their elite quality. So what liberalism has done, and this is, I think, one of the key issues, is that its values have permeated other social movements. I sometimes have difficulty agreeing with my Christian Democrat colleagues, and you should listen to some of the left-wing socialists, what they say about liberals. They're far more condemning of it than I am. So we have political movements which are all to some degree captured, or the captives of liberalism, and it's very difficult for them to disentangle themselves from this embrace of liberalism. It's partly what I'm trying to do. Just in parentheses, in party political terms, any movement becomes significant, it seems to me, when it reaches about 10%. A far right or a far left movement of 5 to 7% is not important. You can live with it, ignoring. When it gets to 20% or 30%, it looks as if the Front National in France is getting this way in the local elections, then you have to tackle it. And what I find fascinating about my colleagues and others is that they won't confront this. They just say, no, we're not going to talk about it, it's just populism. It's an extraordinary phenomenon of not looking reality in the face. It's an argument, obviously, I've had many times. There is one further factor I